Welcome back, boys. Athleticism, size and strength, endurance, agility, mobility. How do they factor into fighting? In what ways are they advantageous and perhaps sometimes disadvantageous? That's what we're talking about in this mini series. And in the first episode, we talked about grappling. If you haven't seen that, go check it out up here. Now, in this episode, we are going to be taking a deep dive into wrestling. And briefly, before we get into that, I do want to talk about why I separated grappling and wrestling into two different videos. Because while I think a lot of martial artists probably understand why I'm doing this, a lot of people who might be interested in fighting but haven't practiced combat sports themselves or are just getting started with it might not really know why it makes sense to make that distinction. So, briefly, I think there is some overlap between grappling and wrestling, and there's actually also some overlap between striking and wrestling, if you look at things like the clinch, for example, or sweeps in Muay Thai. But while grappling sports contain some wrestling, and wrestling sports, at least many of them, might have some grappling techniques in there, fundamentally, grappling is about manipulating your opponent in ways that allow you to damage his body or, choke him out by restricting his airways or his blood flow to the brain, things of that nature. Wrestling is a much more fundamental engagement with your opponent that is all about control at the end of the day. Controlling where the fight takes place. Where are you and your opponent moving? How are you facing each other, right? Which direction is your opponent facing? Which direction are you facing? Does the fight stay on the feet? Does it go to the ground? Which one of you goes to the ground? Are you both going down? Is just your opponent going to the ground? These types of things. If you do go to the ground, controlling your opponent's movement. All of these things, in my opinion, make up wrestling, where grappling is more, again, about manipulating your opponent's body in an attempt to damage it, in an attempt to hurt him in some way, shape, or form. You can, of course, hurt your opponent with wrestling moves like throws, but the main focus is taking your opponent to the ground, usually, and then controlling him there, not necessarily inflicting damage. In this sense, I do actually think that wrestling is very foundational to fighting in general, and even though we're going to talk about the influence athleticism has on different aspects of fighting, I also want to point out that gaining skill in some kind of wrestling sport, so training your ability to wrestle people, will probably have the biggest impact on your ability to fight in general if you're not going to learn another martial art. This is actually why I usually recommend to people, if they only wanted to practice one martial art or combat sport, to go for wrestling, the actual sport of wrestling. All things considered, if you're just going to learn one martial art or one combat sport, if you had to pick one and you're not going to do anything else, you're probably getting the most bang for your buck out of wrestling. All that being said, let's get into the topic of athleticism in wrestling. How much does this influence your ability to wrestle people? And we're not talking specifically about any style of wrestling. We're not talking about any specific style of competition. We are talking about wrestling in the general sense, again, of wrestling someone. Now, before we talk about size, which is going to be the first aspect of physicality, of athleticism that we're getting into, I do want to point out, as I did in the grappling video, that the level of clothing and the type of clothing you and your opponent are wearing is going to influence how relevant skill is in your encounter. Wrestling skill is always going to be extremely relevant. Of course, if your opponent is a very, very skilled wrestler and you are very incompetent, that's going to be a problem no matter whether you're naked or you're fully dressed in like winter clothing, right? But relatively speaking, the more opportunities for manipulation someone's clothing offers, the more valuable skill is going to be. Again, as with grappling, if you are wearing clothing that offers a lot of opportunities for your opponent to grab onto, to essentially use to his advantage, that's going to make skill more valuable as opposed to you being naked, which is essentially going to offer the least amount of opportunities to manipulate your body through just grabbing onto things. And so, relatively speaking, skill is going to be less important, although, of course, it is still very, very important. And I would actually argue that with wrestling, this is an even bigger deal than with grappling, because while there are some things you can do with, let's say, a winter jacket, right? There are some ways in which you can actually use a piece of clothing like that to choke out your opponent, for example. I think in many cases, the kinds of techniques for attacking your opponent's joints or trying to choke him out that work on an opponent that is basically naked, things like a triangle choke, a rear naked choke, that type of thing, are usually going to be the easiest techniques to also use on an opponent that is fully dressed. And most of the advantages you would get out of someone's clothing in, let's say, a BJJ match are going to be more wrestling type opportunities, right? The opportunity to get into certain positions, the opportunity to move your opponent around in ways that you might not be able to if he wasn't wearing a gi, for example. Most of this stuff that you're going to be able to do, most of this stuff that's going to be a bonus to skill, essentially, is actually going to be more wrestling related. Whereas the actual submissions, yes, there are definitely submissions that involve the clothing, but the ones that you're going to get the most opportunities for are probably still going to be the ones that you would be able to do anyways. With wrestling, however, just having long sleeves on a fucking jacket or shirt is going to completely change the leverages someone can use against you. So clothing already changes the relative value of skill in a grappling context. In a wrestling context, I think this is even more the case. It's an even bigger deal than it was before. Now let's get into actual physical traits and how they impact your wrestling performance. Starting as we did with the last video with size. Now, I mentioned in the grappling video that I don't think just being bigger than your opponent, not necessarily much stronger, just bigger, maybe you're a little bit taller, you're significantly fatter than your opponent, so you're essentially heavier, but you don't have a significant advantage in muscle mass. I mentioned that I don't actually think that is a huge advantage in grappling. Certainly not as big an advantage as a lot of people seem to think. And if you're interested in learning why, again, go ahead, check out the video. In the context of wrestling, though, I think this is a different story entirely. Size can be an extremely big advantage, especially if it's paired with a low center of gravity. Some of the worst people to wrestle are people who have relatively low stances already. Maybe they have short legs, maybe they're just short in general, and then they're pretty heavy on top of that. These are some of the most difficult people to throw. If you're fighting someone who's a little bit shorter than you, has shorter legs as well, and is actually heavier than you, getting that guy off the ground, taking him down, throwing him is going to be a fucking pain. The reason why this is the case, I think, is because wrestling is not quite as detailed, not quite as finicky as grappling. It's a little bit rougher. It's a little bit more general. Again, it's about a very general, fundamental sort of control. I'm going to try to find a good translation for the German grobmotorisch, which I think perfectly hits the nail on the head. And if I find something good, I'm going to throw it up here. But in essence, grappling is more detailed, more sort of technical. Not to say that there are not a lot of different techniques involved in wrestling sports, like, Greco-Roman wrestling or judo, but wrestling as a sort of part of fighting is a lot rougher, is a lot more physical in general, and thus size makes a huge fucking difference. However, I think size has a lot more value defensively than it does offensively if you don't know how to use it properly. One of the big problems with size, especially size that is not muscle-based, size that you don't have necessarily a huge amount of control over because it's just excess weight, essentially, is that once you get going, it's hard to stop. Someone who is 60 kgs compared to someone who is 90 kgs can make much sharper turns, can stop and start moving again, turn, go this way, go that way. He has a lot more directional control. Now, of course, this is because there's also much less power in his movements, okay? Someone who's 60 kgs pushing someone who's 90 kgs or pulling someone who's 90 kgs this way or that way, that's a lot less intense than the other way around. But because it is less intense, he can also adjust his movements much more specifically. So once you're facing an opponent who is very, very, very skilled, and you're just, at an advantage size-wise, but you're basically not skilled at all, if you start moving in any way and try to go on the offense, your size can very quickly become a problem. If you're facing a skilled judoka, a skilled wrestler, just getting the ball rolling, just putting your weight into motion can turn into a problem for you if the other person takes advantage of that movement and actually uses your momentum against you. And I think that can happen very quickly if you're not skilled at all. As soon as skill starts to enter the picture, this is less of a problem, but this is the reason why I think size alone, if we're not talking about a huge muscular advantage, we're mainly talking about just excess weight, again, is mostly beneficial defensively, not so much offensively. It can be to an extent, but not as much as the next thing I want to talk about, which is muscle. Muscle-based size and strength. As with grappling, this is going to be much more valuable than size based on things like body fat, because not only do you have a weight advantage, the additional weight is actually muscle fiber that makes you stronger than your opponent. So this is not just random weight you have on your opponent. It is specifically additional motor units or additional ability to generate force intentionally. And I actually think strength, which I mentioned as a very big advantage in a grappling context, is even more valuable in wrestling. For the simple reason that, again, wrestling is a much more physical aspect of fighting, in my opinion, than grappling is. Both have physicality involved in them, but I think grappling, relatively speaking, is more about skill than wrestling is. Now, similarly to grappling, I do think that strength is a bigger advantage defensively if you have essentially no skill at all. So if you have the sort of rudimentary level of skill that allows you to maybe spot a sweep or takedown attempt, that sort of thing, spot someone trying to hip throw you or do something to you in any of these regards, you can do a lot with strength to get out of these positions. And on the ground as well, if someone is trying to pin you, if someone is trying to control you in a unfortunate position, let's put it like that, you can use strength in many cases to get out of that if your opponent is significantly smaller, even if he knows what he's doing. Of course, this always depends. I've mentioned this several times in the last video on how big the skill gap is and how big the strength gap is, but strength can compensate for skill to a pretty significant degree. In terms of offense, though, you will need to know some techniques for strength to really be beneficial to you. It's not going to do a lot for you, and in fact, going in with a lot of strength, as I mentioned with size before, if you're exerting a lot of force but you don't really understand how to do so properly, can actually be detrimental to you. It's usually not going to go too badly for you in a grappling context. In most situations, your opponent is just going to avoid you trying to do something to them. In a wrestling context, if you're trying to stay on your feet and take the opponent down, for example, and you exert a lot of force, this may actually end up with you being taken down because of the force you exerted. So even though I do think strength makes a bigger difference in wrestling, it's also much more important in an offensive context to combine it with skill. Once skill does enter the picture, though, and we're not talking about a high level here, just some rudimentary skills, some ability to take someone down, some understanding of how you're going to control an opponent on the ground, prevent them from slipping out, prevent them from getting back up, that sort of thing. Once the basics are there, strength is fucking huge. It's really, really going to give you a lot in terms of dealing with an opponent. Now, the higher you and your opponent go in skill level, so if we're talking about a purple belt versus a black belt, compared to a white belt versus a green belt or an orange belt or something like that in judo, I think the less general skill is involved, the more valuable strength is going to be overall. So even if the sort of distance between belts is the same in the example I just described, or more or less the same, strength is going to be a much bigger deal at a lower level. High-level people are going to be able to deal with a stronger opponent better overall. So even though strength is still going to be valuable, I don't think it's going to factor into the encounter as much. Skill, relatively speaking, is going to be more important. But nonetheless, across the board, no matter how skilled you get, strength is going to be incredibly valuable. And being able to use the skills you do have with a lot of strength, similarly to grappling, is going to allow you to just brute force a lot of things you do know. If you get your opponent's arm, you're sort of securely, and you are just way stronger than they are. You're 20 kilos heavier than your opponent, and it's basically, again, 50, 60, 70% muscle mass. If you want to do a Seonaga, it's going to happen. Your opponent is not going to prevent that. If you want to throw your opponent, he's going down. Okay? The fact that you can just grab your opponent and pick him up if you are stronger than him. Just pick him up off his feet. You can literally just lift him up and throw him on the ground if you want to. Huge deal. Now, looking at specific types of strength, I also think that explosive strength, relatively speaking, is more valuable in wrestling than it is in grappling. And again, this comes down to the fact that I think wrestling is a more physical aspect of fighting than grappling is, whereas grappling is more technical, on the other hand. And in grappling, strength endurance is, as I mentioned in the previous video, very, very valuable for its defensive capabilities. I think in wrestling, the value of explosive strength is incredibly high. For executing moves, of course, if you are able to generate an insane amount of force in the moment you are actually performing a throw, a takedown, what have you, that is going to enhance your technique to an insane degree. Because the techniques you use are actually about exerting a explosive sort of power, because you're throwing an opponent, because you're smashing an opponent to the ground, that type of thing, explosive strength, very, very valuable here. On the ground, when you're trying to pin an opponent, that type of stuff, strength endurance will become more valuable. And of course, across the board, it's still important to have a consistent level of strength that you can maintain in the long term over a longer period of time. But I do think that explosive strength also has more value defensively in wrestling, because your opponent will try to explode on you. That, sounds a little bit sexual, but let's move past that. Your opponent will try to exert this high level of power in sort of brief moments when he is trying to throw you, when he is trying to take you down, right? When he is trying to quickly grab your leg, that sort of thing. So speed, explosive strength, power, we can sort of put it together as power, a huge deal in wrestling. And because of this, being able to, in these brief moments, very intensely resist what your opponent is doing, very intensely resist his attempted throw or his attempted takedown, something like that, is incredibly important. Let's move on to endurance. And again, I do think endurance, while insanely important in grappling as well, relatively speaking, is more important in wrestling just because wrestling is more physical. I think wrestling in general is more strenuous than grappling. It's more intense physically. And because across the board it is more physical, it requires more endurance. Grappling requires a lot of endurance. Grappling can be very, very intense, and grappling can really drain the energy out of you, but not as much as wrestling. I think wrestling, because it is rougher, because it is more physical, it just saps the energy out of you like crazy. So right off the bat, endurance, relatively speaking, more important in wrestling, but that's just because, generally speaking, wrestling is more physical than grappling across the board. Now, we basically have the same situation here as we did with grappling. Endurance itself, not really going to do much for you if you don't have something else. So any and all types of endurance are more of a passive attribute. You can't really utilize endurance to attack your opponent or defend against him if you don't have either skill or strength to go with that endurance. Because what are you going to do? Nothing, right? Endurance allows you to use your skill or strength over longer periods of time, or to use it more intensely in the moment without gassing out, but it's not going to do anything for you if you just have endurance. I do think I talked about that a little bit more in depth in the last video, so if you haven't seen it, again, go check it out. I'm not going to dive into that too much in this one. What I will say is that of the 3 types of endurance that I talked about in the last video, which was sort of general endurance that you would train with steady state cardio, so your ability to do a little bit of work over a very long period of time, your sort of immediate stamina, your ability to do something fairly intense over as long a period of time as possible, which you would train with something like sprints. So you're in the moment endurance, if you will. And then thirdly, the ability to kind of recover a little bit of endurance, recover a little bit of stamina as quickly as possible. Out of these 3, I do think the more in the moment, the more immediate type of stamina that you would train with something like sprints, which kind of complements more explosive strength, which exerts a lot of force in the moment. So, of course, that goes very well with this type of endurance, I do think is also more important in wrestling. So just as explosive strength, relatively speaking, is more valuable in wrestling compared to grappling, where strength endurance, I think, has a greater value comparatively. I also think that your immediate stamina, your ability to exert a lot of force for ideally as long a time as possible, is, comparatively speaking, more valuable in wrestling. Essentially, for all the same reasons that I explained in regards to explosive strength. Again, this more immediate type of stamina, the type of endurance you would train with things like sprints, with high intensity interval training. This is essentially the type of endurance that complements explosive strength. And so, if explosive strength, relatively speaking, is quite important in wrestling, of course, this type of endurance will also be very important as well. However, despite this fact, of course, more sort of long-term general endurance still is to an extent valuable, and especially if we're talking about defense, especially if we're talking about early preventions of enemy attacks. So you're not in like full-on throw mode. The guy doesn't have your arm over his shoulder and is pulling on you like crazy, but sort of early on, the pushing and pulling, the kind of testing the opponent's defenses, trying to go for an underhook, that type of thing. All of this is not that intense yet, and this is where that longer term, more low-key kind of endurance is really going to come into play. So defensively speaking, still very important, but this more immediate type of stamina, both defensively and offensively, is a bigger deal than it was in grappling. And then lastly, as with grappling, the ability to quickly recover a little bit of energy if there's like a few seconds of rest, a few seconds of quiet between storms, huge, extremely important, extremely valuable. Again, because endurance in general is such a big deal, the ability to recover some of it quickly is going to be huge. There are going to be moments in some matches against some people where you will have that opportunity, where you're essentially just circling your opponent. Maybe you have each other's arms. Maybe you're, again, trying to go for an underhook, trying to go for a necktie. You're grappling around with the arms a little bit maybe, but you're not really doing anything intense for a couple of seconds. And if those couple of seconds after, let's say, a throw or a takedown attempt are enough for you to really recover a bit of energy, huge deal. Very, very big deal. Going to be a very big advantage against your opponent. Next up on our list, we got agility. Outside of specific skill, outside of specific techniques, how well do you move? How efficiently, how effectively do you move? What's your balance like? What's your spatial awareness like? How in tune are you with every single part of your body? Agility is very valuable in wrestling. It has a lot of the same benefits it does in the world of grappling, which is to say that agility will make your application of techniques a lot more effective, a lot more energy efficient as well. And it will make learning techniques, learning how to wrestle well in general, a lot easier, because people who are very agile, people who are very in touch with their body intuitively, are great at learning movements, are great at learning techniques, are great at understanding how something physically works when someone shows it to them. And they very quickly learn how to do techniques well in a way that really works, in a way that really has all their joints and muscles and tendons working in tandem to create something that exerts a lot of power or preserves a lot of energy while doing what they're supposed to be doing. However, with wrestling, an additional benefit of agility compared to grappling is its defensive capabilities. Even if you don't have any skill, because wrestling is more general, it's not as technical, it's a lot more physical, it's a lot more I'm throwing you to the ground. I'm pushing you over there. I'm trying to control you on the ground, right? It's not as specific. It's not as detailed. Again, it's more grobmotorisch. If I do find a good translation, it's going to be right up here. Because of this fact, agility, the ability to intuitively move well on your feet and on the ground, is going to be potentially a game changer defensively. If someone is very, very agile, even if they don't know a ton about wrestling, just intuitively, it's going to be much harder to throw them. It's going to be much harder to take them down, that type of thing. It's going to be much harder to control them on the ground. Because just intuitively, instinctually, they move very well. They are very good at staying on their feet. They are very good at avoiding attacks, that sort of thing. So where with grappling, I kind of compared agility to a very significant degree to endurance, where it's mostly valuable in combination with strength or skill. With wrestling, I would say that agility kind of stands on its own 2 feet to an extent, especially on the feet, ironically. Agility is going to be a very big deal defensively. And so in addition to being great at making you more efficient in the use of your strength or your skills, which was the same for grappling, same goes here as well. Agility is going to make you more effective, more efficient at using what you already have, technique and skill, and or strength and size. In addition to this, agility on its own is already very, very valuable to keep you on your feet, prevent your opponent from throwing you. Although, again, it's definitely more valuable while you're still on your feet. Once your opponent has gotten you down to the ground and is trying to pin you in some way, strength is going to be your friend to a much more significant degree than agility is. And then finally, let's talk about mobility. And sadly, I got to say that I don't think mobility really does that much for you in the wrestling context. Being very, very stiff, very tight, not able to move a lot is definitely not great. But once we're talking about a sort of moderate level of mobility, like the kind of movement your average, relatively athletic person has, beyond that, we're not seeing any sort of significant relevance when it comes to mobility. It's not that big of a deal. You can perform most techniques in judo, in wrestling, without being super flexible. There are some things, some techniques, some positions, some situations where mobility will be advantageous. Is it, in general, better to have that mobility than not have it? Sure. But overall, I would say spending a lot of time training your mobility is not going to be a big benefit in the wrestling context if you could spend that time working on your strength, your endurance, or improving your agility. The one thing I can think of where mobility is probably a little bit more beneficial is when you're trying to get out of a pin. But that's really a very specific scenario, and in most other cases, having a super high level of mobility compared to an opponent who's like at a normal level of mobility, let's say, not really a big deal. Okay, being able to do the splits, not going to do a ton for you, or being able to put your legs behind your head. It's not a super valuable skill in wrestling compared to just being jacked as fuck, for example. So I'm not going to dive into this too much because wrestling is more physical, because it's not as technical, where in grappling, advanced mobility provides you with the ability to just do a lot of things that you otherwise wouldn't be able to do, apply techniques certain ways, move around your opponent in certain ways, that sort of thing. This is just not the case in wrestling. Wrestling is a lot more rough, a lot more physical, and mobility just doesn't do much for you in that regard. It's not useless, but it's certainly, I would say, the most useless out of these 4 aspects of athleticism that I've talked about. And I think I'm going to leave it at that. As in the last video, my voice is starting to slip away. So if you guys enjoyed yourselves, if you found this interesting, learned something, or were perhaps even inspired to change your training up a little bit to train certain aspects of athleticism that might be a greater benefit in the world of fighting, go ahead and leave a like down below. If you're interested in building an athletic physique that is Ooga Booga, strong and powerful, but also has good endurance, agility, mobility, all that good stuff, hand-eye coordination, all the shit you could want. Go ahead and check out the Primal Physique course down below in the description. This program is going to take you through a step-by-step process of making training a habit in your life at all that doesn't feel like a chore, that feels like an everyday activity. You're going to learn about nutrition, about different types of training, about habits you should include into your life outside of training and nutrition that are going to benefit your overall athleticism, your physical capability. The course contains training programs, an exemplary diet plan, information on how to consistently progress on your training and diet as you try to lose or gain weight. So if you want a full, comprehensive program that's going to teach you anything you could possibly need to know to build a body of the fucking gods, go ahead, check out the course. And if you're interested in a more personalized approach, if you want my personal help with your athletic endeavors, with your goals and ambitions, you can also go ahead and just hit me up on Coffee, where the course is, or on Instagram, which is also down below in the description. Just go ahead and shoot me a DM and we can talk details over there. If you want to see more videos of mine in the future, obviously go ahead and subscribe. It's free, so why not just click that subscribe button? I make videos on training, on general health, some aspects of philosophy as well. So a very holistic approach to fitness. And if that's something you're interested in, again, go ahead, subscribe. And as always, activate the notification bell if you want notifications. That's going to be it. Feel free to leave a comment about your experience with athleticism in combat sports, and in this case, specifically in the world of wrestling. I'll see you guys in the next one when my voice is hopefully back again for the third part of this series, which of course is going to be on striking. I'll see you guys in that next video, and until then, have a good one.